Hi, so this is my presentation on classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is learning by associating two separate stimuli and anticipating the subsequent events or anticipating the resulting events. The scientist behind classical conditioning is Pavlov, and he's very famous for his work with dogs. He was originally studying their digestive systems and accidentally sort of stumbled on this fundamental form of learning, which is classical conditioning. So in his experiments, he found that dogs would salivate in the presence of food. And so he would ring a bell before giving the dogs food, and eventually the dogs learned that if the bell rung, that meant that they were getting food. And that's how we discovered classical conditioning. And I think the best way to explain classical conditioning is by using an example. And so this is my little diagram here of an example of classical conditioning in my own life. But first, I'm going to explain these acronyms on the bottom. So the U and the C stand for unconditioned and conditioned. Unconditioned is just meaning unlearned. And then conditioned is what we've learned, basically. So unconditioned stimuli is US, unconditioned response is UR, NS is neutral stimuli, CS is conditioned stimuli, and CR is conditioned response. So here's my example of classical conditioning. So I have 5 cats, and I used to give them treats just randomly throughout the day. But I noticed that when I moved into my new apartment that they got very nervous when I left. So I decided that I would start giving them treats right before I left the apartment. So in this case, the US would be me shaking the treats, to get their attention, shaking the treats. And the UR would be them coming and swarming around me for treats. So when I decided to start giving them treats when I left the house or the apartment, I'd have to put my shoes on first. And so that would be the neutral stimuli, the NS, and they wouldn't respond to that. And that's a picture of one of my cats. They just kind of didn't really care that I was putting shoes on. However, if they saw me put shoes on and then I shook the treats, they would come and swarm me. So with the NS occurring before the US, the UR would occur. So eventually they learned that if I put my shoes on, that they were going to get treats. So the neutral response, the NS, turned into the CS, and the UR turned into the CR, and that's basically what classical conditioning is. There are 5 major conditioning processes. The first one being acquisition, which is what I just explained. It's when it's the initial learning of an association. So when the NS turns into the CS and the UR turns into the CR. However, if the US, if I shook the treats, occurred before the NS, I put my shoes on, so the treats occurring before I put the shoes on, classical conditioning wouldn't necessarily occur because classical conditioning is biologically adaptive, which basically means that over time humans and animals have learned to survive by responding to stimuli that would help them acquire food, find shelter, find a mate, avoid danger. So they don't care that I put my shoes on. All they care about is me giving them a treat, me giving them food. So they'll respond to that, not me putting my shoes on. So if I gave them the treats first and then put the shoes on, they wouldn't learn that, she's putting her shoes on, I'm going to get a treat, because they would have already gotten the treat. The second term is extinction, and that basically means if the CS would occur without the US, which basically means if I were starting to put my shoes on and decided that I wasn't going to give them a treat, that would be extinction, was eventually that they would sort of unlearn the conditioned response. However, there's a term called spontaneous recovery, and that's basically if I decided to give them treats again after putting my shoes on, they would respond to it again. So basically, I'm saying that if the CS were to start occurring with the US again after a period of time where the US wasn't happening, the CR would come back. It would come back weekly, and it would take time for it to be as strong as it used to be, but it will be there. And so that just means that extinction doesn't get rid of the CR, it only suppresses it. Then the fourth term is generalization or stimulus generalization, which just means that if it would mean that the CR would occur in response to a CS that was just similar to a similar CS, not the actual CS. So the cats would swarm around me to something similar as putting my shoes on. Like, for example, in the winter and it's cold and I put socks on, I'm not leaving, but they don't know that. All they know is I'm putting something on my feet, so they think that I'm going to give them treats, but I'm not. So that's just generalization, is they're responding to something similar to the CS, similar to me putting my shoes on. And then lastly, discrimination is basically being able to distinguish between the CS and all other stimuli.